Her circle grew. A friend named Nina introduced orange walks. They bought one orange, shared it slice by slice, and walked the neighborhood. These tiny rituals gave Siera reasons to stay grounded. When she whispered, "I had a bad dream," Nina didn't ask for details. She simply asked if Siera had drunk water. Care could be that simple. Therapy helped her shift perspective. She no longer felt pressured to retell every detail of her past. Instead, she practiced grounding, naming 5 things she saw, 4 she touched, 3 she heard. It seemed childish, yet it worked. On buses or in crowded streets, she learned to calm her body without spiraling back into old memories. Siera enrolled in GD classes. Her hands shook when she signed her name, but the teacher reassured her, "Wherever your name lands, it belongs." Passing her first quiz felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Each small step proved she was no longer defined by what had been taken from her. Not every day was easy. Grief still hid in odd moments, anger at the toaster, tears in the grocery store. But she had a map now, the fern in the hallway, Nina's spare key, her list of safe sentences taped to the fridge. "I need a break. I'll get back to you." "I can't today." She learned that progress wasn't the absence of pain, but the presence of choices. Instead of being pulled back into chaos, she could pause, breathe, and choose differently. One evening at group, another woman whispered, "I don't think I deserve good." Siera handed her a cup of tea and said, "Hold this, it's for you." They sat in silence until the steam faded. Healing, Siera realized, was often that small, staying long enough with warmth that you forget you once lived without it. Siera doesn't pretend the road ahead is simple, but she knows it is hers now. She no longer walks back into rooms that demand she abandon herself. She has built new doorways, ones that stay open. Not traps disguised as choices. If you saw her today, walking with an orange in her pocket, a notebook under her arm, you might not know the storm she survived, but you would see the steadiness in her step and the way she holds doors for others. Because she remembers what it felt like to wonder if any door would ever open. Now she lives to prove some doors don't slam. Some doors wait for you, unlocked until you're ready to walk through. Despite everything, Siera tried to survive by laughing, joking, and finding small sparks of joy. She describes herself as the kind of kid who always wanted to laugh, but inside she carried pain and fear that never went away. At night, she would lie awake wondering why her mother didn't want her, why her father was never there, and why the people who were supposed to protect her always hurt her instead. The system that was supposed to keep her safe often failed. Even when clear evidence of abuse was presented, she was sent back to unsafe environments. The cycle repeated itself again and again. She would be taken away, placed with strangers, experience abuse, then moved again. Each time, her trust in people eroded a little more. By the time Siera reached 10 years old, she was already carrying a lifetime of trauma. She had endured more than many adults ever would. Her sense of self-worth was deeply damaged. She began to believe she was unwanted, unloved, and that perhaps this was all her life would ever be. She describes feeling invisible, like no one cared whether she lived or died. Still, a part of her longed for connection. She wanted someone to look at her and truly see her, not as a burden, not as an object, but as a child who needed love. That desire would shape the choices she made later in her life. For now, though, Siera was still a little girl, just trying to survive each day. Her story was only beginning, but already it carried the weight of tragedy, resilience, and a desperate search for belonging. Siera was only 11 when she decided she couldn't take it anymore. The shouting, the endless movement between homes, the feeling that no one wanted her, she bolted. One night she ran, no plan, no belongings, just the desperate urge to disappear. The streets of Los Angeles swallowed her whole. Neon lights, crowded sidewalks, and the constant noise of cars were overwhelming, but at least out here she wasn't locked inside. She thought freedom would taste sweet, but it quickly turned bitter. The streets had their own dangers, ones Siera couldn't yet understand. It didn't take long before someone noticed her vulnerability. She was small, fragile, clearly a runaway. At first, a man seemed friendly. He gave her food, told her he could help. For a child with nowhere to turn, his words felt like a lifeline. But promises of safety came with invisible chains. Soon he was dictating where she went, who she spoke to, what she did. Freedom had turned into another form of captivity. The streets also introduced her to substances that dulled her fear. The first time she tried cocaine, she thought she had discovered courage in powdered form. The rush was powerful, but it left her emptier than before. Drugs became both her armor and her weakness, a way to keep moving when her body wanted to collapse. Siera began drifting into circles of other kids like her, lost, forgotten, surviving on scraps and adrenaline. They would huddle together, sharing stories and stolen food, trying to laugh away the heaviness of their lives. For a brief moment, it felt like family. But it was also a world where violence was routine, where trust could turn into betrayal overnight. Her sense of self-worth eroded quickly. Adults no longer saw her as a child. They saw an opportunity. Siera didn't have the language to describe it then, but she understood one thing clearly. Her body was being traded for survival. She told herself it was temporary, that she would find another way. Yet each passing day made it harder to believe. At 12, she looked in the mirror and hardly recognized herself. Her eyes seemed older, her laughter less frequent. She still tried to hold on to fragments of who she had been, doodling on scraps of paper, humming songs she remembered from childhood, but the streets demanded more of her each day. By 13, she had already seen more than most adults ever would. She carried memories too heavy for a teenager, secrets that kept her awake at night. But despite everything, a quiet voice inside whispered, "This isn't the end. There has to be something else." Siera didn't know when or how, but she clung to that fragile hope. It was the only thing separating her from despair. And as she would soon learn, hope, no matter how small, can be the beginning of survival. By the time Siera turned 13, survival had become her full-time reality. The first rush of rebellion, running away, thinking she had escaped, was long gone. What replaced it was routine. Nights in motels with people she barely knew, mornings spent searching for food, afternoons trying to avoid police who saw her only as another runaway. The man who had promised to protect her had revealed his true nature. He controlled her movements, her clothes, even her words. Siera realized too late that she had walked into another cage. Sometimes it was subtle, gentle persuasion, promises of affection, but often it was harsh and physical. Fear became the language of her life. Still, Siera was resourceful. She created small strategies to survive, staying close to other girls, memorizing escape routes in motels, pretending to agree while quietly plotting how to resist. She learned how to mask her emotions, how to smile when her heart was breaking. It was her armor. There were moments of strange solidarity, too. In cramped motel rooms, the girls she lived with became like sisters. They shared whispered conversations after the lights went out, dreams of school, of families who cared, of futures that seemed impossibly far away. They braided each other's hair, shared makeup, and laughed at jokes only they understood. For a few minutes at a time, they could pretend they were normal teenagers, but the reality always returned. Siera often drifted out of her body, watching herself from a distance. It was the only way she could endure. Drugs added another layer of escape. Cocaine blurred the edges of her pain, numbed the fear, gave her a false sense of invincibility. Yet every high was followed by a crash, leaving her more fragile than before. She began to notice how the cycle consumed others. One girl disappeared overnight, never to be seen again. Another overdosed, her absence haunting the group for weeks. Each loss carved into Siera's heart, a reminder of how precarious their lives were. And yet, even as the darkness closed in, Siera clung to fragments of hope. She remembered a stranger once giving her food without asking for anything in return. She remembered a kind word from another runaway, "You're stronger than you think." These brief moments reminded her that not everyone in the world wanted to hurt her. At 14, the man who controlled her started moving her farther, across neighborhoods, across city lines, even out of state. Each move erased her a little more, cutting ties to anyone who might have been able to help. She became invisible, existing in the margins of society, a ghost drifting from place to place. But inside, a spark remained. Siera dreamed of escape, of finding a life where no one could control her, where she could laugh without fear. She didn't know when or how, but she refused to believe that her story had to end on the streets. Her body was tired, her spirit scarred, but her will to survive was still alive. And that will, fragile yet unbroken, would one day become her way out. By 15, Siera had learned to move like water, quiet, cautious, and always alert. Each room she entered, she scanned for exits. Each stranger's tone told her if it was safe to stay or time to vanish. Survival had become second nature. Life shifted between brief moments of calm and sudden control. Sometimes the man who kept her in his orbit eased the pressure. Other times his grip tightened, deciding where she went, when she spoke, and who she saw. The motels blurred together, but she memorized escape routes, an alley, a stairwell, a clerk who once offered her tea without asking questions. She found small refuges. A laundromat that stayed open all night, where warm air from the dryers felt like comfort. A church basement serving soup on Tuesdays, its walls pinned with handwritten notes that read, "If you need help, ask for Maria." She never called, but the word stayed with her. Other girls drifted in and out, some for weeks, some for a single night. They shared what little they had, lip balm, chocolate, hair ties, and dreamed aloud about impossible futures. One wanted to be a tattoo artist, another a dental assistant. Siera said she wanted to design clothes, and the thought surprised her by how true it felt. She began sketching on scraps of paper, jackets with hidden zippers, pockets big enough to hold secrets. Armor disguised as fashion. She tried quitting drugs several times. A week here, 3 days there. Each attempt brought restless nights and dreams too vivid to bear. When panic came, she used a trick she'd learned from a hotline counselor. Count 5 things you see, 4 things you feel, 3 things you hear. It calmed her just enough to keep moving forward. At 16, a nurse at a community clinic asked simple questions Siera had never heard before. "Have you eaten today? Do you have somewhere safe to sleep?" The kindness unsettled her, but she carried it with her. The nurse wrote her name in a notebook, reminding Siera that someone saw her as a person worth saving. Control around her tightened again, but Siera learned patience. She spoke less, listened more, and gathered details quietly. Each day she stitched plans together the way she stitched her thrift store jacket, slowly, carefully, adding hidden pockets for bus cards and scraps of hope. Losses came often, friends who disappeared, one who left for detox and never returned. To remember them, Siera wrote their names in her notebook and drew a stitched line beside each, seams of survival. One winter day she stepped into a library for warmth and found sanctuary. No one stared. Someone pointed her toward a quiet table and an outlet. She charged a borrowed phone, looked up GED classes, and slipped a crisis hotline flyer into her jacket. That night she dreamt of doorways, not cages. On her 17th birthday, unspoken by anyone, she bought a cupcake and shared it with a girl she barely knew. When asked to make a wish, she whispered silently, "A door that opens and stays open." Not long after, an argument broke out nearby. Voices rose, threats circled. While the chaos grew, Siera put on her jacket, tucked her notebook inside, and walked calmly toward the vending machine. She kept walking, out the door, down the street, onto a bus. She rode past familiar stops, then doubled back to a shelter she'd memorized weeks before. At the intake window, a woman handed her a clipboard. "You made it just in time," she said. Siera wrote her name clearly, steady hand for the first time in years. For emergency contact, she wrote the nurse's number. That night, lying on a clean bed in a quiet room, she sketched a doorway in her notebook. Beneath it she wrote, "Tomorrow is not yesterday." For the first time she slept without planning an escape. She had already taken it. Healing didn't arrive like sirens or fireworks. It came quietly, through small routines that built a new kind of safety. Siera learned to water a plant before work, to text a friend instead of someone who once hurt her, to eat breakfast even when she had no appetite. These ordinary choices became bricks in the foundation of her future. She rented a tiny studio apartment with one window and a view of a brick wall. To anyone else it might have looked bleak, but to her it was freedom. She taped a note to the door, reminding herself, "Check your keys," because she still feared being locked out of safety. Her elderly neighbor watered the hallway fern each morning. Siera watered it at night. That became their quiet ritual, proof that someone noticed her existence. At first she slept with the light on, out of habit. By the third week she turned it off, leaving the blinds cracked so dawn could filter in. For the first time in years she woke with sunlight instead of panic. Money remained a challenge, but she divided her earnings into envelopes: rent, food, bus fare, savings. Even $5 went into her music envelope each week, allowing her to buy a thrifted CD or tip a street performer. It reminded her she was more than survival. She was allowed joy. Through a flyer at the community center, she found part-time work as a receptionist. Nervous at first, she practiced smiling in the mirror. On her second day, a woman broke down crying at the desk, apologizing for the tears. Siera offered tissues and said, "You don't have to be sorry for breathing." The words surprised her, but they became a lesson she carried forward. Compassion can be simple. Once a week she sat in on the women's group, not as a speaker but as support. She made tea, took notes, and held the door open. The door, such a symbol for her, meant everything. She had spent her childhood looking for exits. Now she offered safe entry for others. Her circle grew. A friend named Nina introduced orange walks. They bought one orange, shared it slice by slice, and walked the neighborhood. These tiny rituals gave Siera reasons to stay grounded. When she whispered, "I had a bad dream," Nina didn't ask for details. She simply asked if Siera had drunk water. Care could be that simple. Therapy helped her shift perspective. She no longer felt pressured to retell every detail of her past. Instead, she practiced grounding, naming 5 things she saw, 4 she touched, 3 she heard. It seemed childish, yet it worked. On buses or in crowded streets, she learned to calm her body without spiraling back into old memories. Siera enrolled in GD classes. Her hands shook when she signed her name, but the teacher reassured her, "Wherever your name lands, it belongs." Passing her first quiz felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Each small step proved she was no longer defined by what had been taken from her. Not every day was easy. Grief still hid in odd moments, anger at the toaster, tears in the grocery store. But she had a map now, the fern in the hallway, Nina's spare key, her list of safe sentences taped to the fridge. "I need a break." "I'll get back to you." "I can't today." She learned that progress wasn't the absence of pain, but the presence of choices. Instead of being pulled back into chaos, she could pause, breathe, and choose differently. One evening at group, another woman whispered, "I don't think I deserve good." Siera handed her a cup of tea and said, "Hold this, it's for you." They sat in silence until the steam faded. Healing, Siera realized, was often that small, staying long enough with warmth that you forget you once lived without it. Siera doesn't pretend the road ahead is simple, but she knows it is hers now. She no longer walks back into rooms that demand she abandon herself. She has built new doorways, ones that stay open, not traps disguised as choices. If you saw her today, walking with an orange in her pocket, a notebook under her arm, you might not know the storm she survived, but you would see the steadiness in her step and the way she holds doors for others. Because she remembers what it felt like to wonder if any door would ever open. Now she lives to prove some doors don't slam. Some doors wait for you, unlocked until you're ready to walk through.